This is a new Sony ULT Field 1 Bluetooth speaker, and even though it's pretty small, can it deliver a punch that's bigger than its size? Let's find out. What's up, internet? I'm Brian MacDuff, aka BMac, and welcome to another video. So yes, indeed, Sony has launched a new line of audio products with their ULT Power Sound line. But first things first, we do need to give a quick thank you and shout out to Sony for actually sending out one of their Field 1 speakers for me to be able to check out and enjoy. So Sony, thank you. Appreciate you. But with that having been said, let's just dive right into it here, talking about this new Sony Bluetooth speaker by starting things out with the design and what this Field 1 speaker looks like on the outside and what's going on the inside. The Sony ULT Field 1 is a small size Bluetooth speaker built for portability and ruggedness with a little bit of party flair in mind. It's just about 8 inches long, 3 inches high, and 3 inches deep, and it's actually surprisingly pretty lightweight, weighing in at just under 1.5 pounds. You'll also notice these rubberized end caps here, which are going to allow it to stabilize itself when it's on a flat surface, so it's not going to vibrate around when you're listening to music, but also so that it could house these passive radiators on either end. And I think these are in part what's helping the Field 1 to fully utilize Sony's sound diffusion processor technology that's intending to fill a room with music rather than just play music into it. You also do have some dedicated control buttons here for power, pairing, voice assistant, and track controls, alongside a new ULT mode button, which we'll go over in just a few minutes. That ULT mode button, by the way, being backlit when turned on to let you know very easily just by looking at it when you're in the ULT mode. But one thing I do have to say about these buttons, especially most importantly the volume buttons, even though they're tactile and clicky and responsive, they seem to be incremented almost microscopically. What I mean is if I want to quickly change the volume of the music that I'm listening to, I have to press the volume up or volume down buttons like 10 to 20 times before I'm actually able to hear a difference in the volume of the music that I'm listening to. This is something that probably can and perhaps will be fixed and adjusted in a future firmware update, but for right now, I've just found it kind of annoying and tedious that I literally have to go crazy smashing the volume down or the volume up button just to adjust the volume a little bit. So much so, in fact, that I've actually just resorted to getting whatever the connected device is and adjusting the volume through that. The Field 1 does also come with a built-in microphone that allows you to use it as a speakerphone or to actually connect to your smartphone's voice assistant to control whatever kind of playlist or music you're listening to through that. This is what the microphone quality on the Sony ULT Field 1 Bluetooth speaker sounds like. This is raw audio straight from the microphone, recorded directly into my Voice Memos app without any kind of post-production editing. So this is what you could expect. But all this technology and the drivers, everything within this speaker package is wrapped up in a mesh fabric that surrounds the entire Sony speaker itself, despite the fact that music will only be projected in the direction of the Sony logo. With a sealed off compartment here on the back, which once opened will reveal a USB-C port, which you're gonna use to recharge the ULT Field 1 Bluetooth speaker. And for additional portability, you are also getting this built-in removable rope strap here, which you could use as a little handle, or you could also use this to actually attach the speaker to a backpack, to a boat, to a jet ski, you name it. And if you do plan on taking the Field 1 with you out into the wild, know that it does also have an IP67 dust and waterproof rating, plus it is shockproof, so it should be able to withstand a couple of drops onto a hard surface from a few feet up in the air without any kind of problem. And the Field 1 is also available in 4 different color options at the moment. Those color options being black, forest gray, off-white, or orange, all of which look very nice if you ask me. So design-wise, there's a lot to love with the Sony ULT Field 1. It's small, it's compact, it's easy to use, you can splash a little water onto it without a problem, and it actually has a design that helps the overall sound quality. Which, speaking of which, let's talk about that here. The sound quality of the Field 1, which realistically at the end of the day is probably what you care about most anyway. The Field 1 supports SBC and AAC audio codecs, but no LDAC audio codec support here, which I guess at its price point and at its speaker size, isn't all that much of a surprise. And if you're wondering, you do have the ability of actually setting your own custom EQ preset. That'll be done on the Sony Companion app. You're probably gonna find yourself just wanting to use the ULT mode button anyway for the ULT mode. Reason being, and simply put, you're gonna get a richer, fuller, and more powerful sound compared to the otherwise thin sound that you're gonna get out of the drivers when you're in the ULT mode off mode. So with that in mind, almost all the music I've tested with the Field 1 has been with the ULT mode turned on. and I'm happy with the sound that it's providing. What I've noticed is that you're gonna get a pretty punchy sound with a little bit more emphasis in the low end than you're probably used to out of a speaker of this size. However, I have noticed that when you really start to crank up the volume on this thing and it starts to get loud, it'll get loud. But when it starts to get really loud, that's when things kind of start to fall apart a little bit. It's not that it sounds horrible, but things definitely get muddied a little bit and doesn't sound quite as good as it otherwise will when you're listening at 50 to 60%. And I think I'd say that's where the sweet spot is for the speaker, right around 60% volume, because once you go beyond that, that's where you're gonna have a little bit of harshness and aggressiveness from the mids and the highs. They're gonna crowd out a little bit of the bass. So past like 70% volume, this speaker is simply not gonna sound as great as it does around 50 to 60% volume. But if you find yourself cranking this thing up to 80, 90, 100% volume very consistently, chances are you'd probably be better off with a larger, more powerful, louder Bluetooth speaker anyway. Or you could always get a second Sony ULT Field 1 speaker and pair them together for a stereo pair. But if you take into consideration the situations in which you'll use the Field 1 Bluetooth speaker and the situations for which realistically it's designed, such as, by your chairs at the beach, on the patio, by the hot tub, for more intimate settings, I think that's where you'll really want to use the Field 1 Bluetooth speaker. And I think all those are situations in which you're likely going to be listening at 50 to 60% volume anyway. But I know what you're probably wondering here is how long could you actually expect that listening party to last for? What's the battery life looking like on the Field 1? Sony is promising around 12 hours of listening time with ULT mode turned on and when you're at around 50% volume. But if you find yourself constantly cranking up the volume on this thing close to max volume, that's where you're gonna notice a free fall in terms of battery life pretty easily. In fact, you probably should only expect to get around 3, maybe 4 hours of battery life out of the Field 1 if you're listening at max volume and with ULT mode turned on. But even then, that is enough to float you through a multi-hour event. And if you are using this Bluetooth speaker in the more intimate setting, like where I think it's designed to be used, that's where you could pretty much get all day battery life out of it. Perhaps not as robust of battery life performance as some other Bluetooth speakers of its size and in its price range, but not what I would call horrible. Definitely acceptable battery life numbers, especially if you're listening at that sweet spot. And when the time comes to recharge your Field 1, you do also have a quick charge feature you can take advantage of. Just a quick 10-minute charge will yield around 3 hours of battery life, so awesome to have that if you're ever in a crunch situation. But with all that having been said, here are my final thoughts on the Field 1 Bluetooth speaker and whether or not it's a speaker I could recommend to you. Simply put, I'm already a pretty big fan of what Sony has done and is doing with this new ULT Power Sound line. That doesn't mean the Field 1 speaker is perfect. In fact, it's kind of lackluster if you don't have that ULT mode turned on. And yes, the sound quality does deteriorate a little bit if you crank up that volume close to 100%. But design-wise and taking everything else we just talked about into consideration, pairing that with the overall size and price point, as well as the intended use case scenario that I think Sony has created this Bluetooth speaker for, with all that in mind, I think it's definitely worth taking a look at. And if you want to do so, you could of course always see the latest deals, prices, promos, and information for the Sony ULT Field 1 Bluetooth speaker by heading to my affiliate link, bmac.link/field1. Or of course, as always, there's going to be clickable links in the video description box and in the comment section below. So check those out. But with that having been said, now that this video review is filmed, I'm probably just gonna go chill for the rest of the day. Listen to my Field 1, maybe listen to it in a field, listen to the Field 1 in a field. Why not? I will see you guys in my next video.